Hello, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. And thank you for joining this first session of the 2024 GCF Watch International Webinar Series. I'm Camila Bertelega. I work for AIDA, the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense. AIDA is a regional NGO from Latin America and has been following the Green Climate Fund for some time now, and is also part of the GCF Watch Network, which is a platform for civil society organizations that wish to engage with the GCF. We'll have a presentation on the GCF Watch later today. And the GCF Watch webinar series is an event that the network organizes annually. This one is the fourth edition of the webinar series. And the idea is to boost civil society understanding and engagement with the Green Climate Fund, and also to facilitate interaction and collaboration between people working on the GCF and also with other funds under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement in different regions of the world. So just before we start our webinar, I just want to highlight again that although the session will be conducted in English, we have simultaneous interpretation available in Spanish, in Portuguese, and French. So also big thanks to our interpreters here with us today. So if you prefer to listen to the session in one of these languages, you just have to click on the little globe icon at the Zoom taskbar and select your preferred language. Also, would like to thank very much all the civil society organizations from around the world that have helped us to plan, to organize this fourth edition of the GCF Watch International Webinar Series. This is a collective effort, and it would definitely not be possible without the collaboration of this network. So without further ado, I want to share with you the agenda, the schedule we have prepared for today's session. We'll start our webinar with two presentations. In the first one, Erica Lennon will talk a little bit about the Green Climate Fund as the main multilateral climate fund at the center of the financial mechanism of UNFCCC, and also a little bit of its relationships with other climate and environmental funds. Following Erica's presentation, Ira Guerrero will present us the GCF Watch platform and will walk us through its main resources. And then following these two opening presentations, we'll have a panel with civil society representatives that are currently engaging with the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the recently established Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. So the idea of this panel is to see similarities and differences among these different funds, and also to discuss how we as civil society can engage and can advocate in these institutions. Finally, we'll of course leave some time for question and answers from the audience. But in the meantime, please feel free to leave any comments or any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A box in the Zoom. And before we start our first presentation, I just want to remind you that this one today is the first session of the 2024 GCF webinar series, but we'll also have a second webinar that is planned for December 4th. So we hope to see you all again in December as well. Okay, so I think we can start with Erica, our first presentation. Welcome, Erica. Erica is a senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, and she's part of the GCF Observer Network of Civil Society, Indigenous Peoples, and local communities. Erica has been engaging with the Green Climate Fund for a long time now. So Erica, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Camila, and thanks for having me, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. And Florencia, could you share the presentation? Should I share my screen?
Will do so.
Perfect. Perfect. I will start talking as we go. So just to say, so this is going to be an overview of the Green Climate Fund, given its central role in the climate finance architecture. And then I will talk a bit, as Camilla mentioned, about how it relates to both to all of the other sort of climate funds. Next slide. Yeah, so I'll start with a bit about how the GCF was created, how it works, and then how it connects to the multilateral climate funds. Next slide. And one more. Sorry for too many pictures. All right. So climate finance under the UNFCCC, which is also quite a big topic this year. So essentially, under the UNFCCC, as the sort of establishing document of the climate regime, developed countries are obligated to provide climate finance, but it is not specified through which entities it is supposed to go. So it can go through the financial mechanisms, it can go through other multilateral development banks, it can go through bilateral finance. There's a wide range of things. But also in the UNFCCC, Article 11 specifies that there is a financial mechanism that can be served by various entities. And so there are a number of funds and operating entities of the UNFCCC financial mechanism. The first that was established was the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, which came about essentially when the agreement was signed. But it serves the GEF, unlike the GCF, serves multiple multilateral environment agreements. So it serves the Biodiversity Convention, it serves the Mercury Convention. And so it has a sort of broad mandate beyond just climate. And then there's obviously the GCF as one of the operating entities of the financial mechanism. There's now the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which was recently established and is still getting set up. And then there's the Adaptation Fund, which was created under the Kyoto Protocol. And so not an official operating entity of the financial mechanism, quite confusing. But it obviously exists things to fund adaptation explicitly. And so it was also established before the GCF with that explicit adaptation mandate. Next slide. So given, as time went on in the climate regime, it was decided that they needed to have a specific sort of climate fund. And so thus the establishment of the GCF as sort of the primary climate finance mechanism for adaptation and mitigation. Because before then, as I mentioned, they had the GEF and the Adaptation Fund, but both are smaller. The GEF obviously serves multiple ones, and Adaptation Fund served one specific thing, was under the Kyoto Protocol, which also was in some ways going to be replaced or subsumed by the Paris Agreement, and also works slightly differently and had a different sort of, at the time, capitalization structure. So the mandate for the GCF was given at COP16 in Cancun in 2010. And you can see there, I just put the one of the paragraphs that talks about the GCF that decided to establish it. And so when they decided to establish it, there were a couple things that were really critical to making the GCF sort of what it is as the main multilateral, as the main like climate finance mechanism. And a couple of the important things that I've highlighted here about it is that the decision included critically that it would have equal representation on the board. So unlike sort of traditional international financial institutions, the GCF has a balanced board with 12 board members from developed countries and 12 from developing countries, notably the Adaptation Fund, and I think now the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, have more developing country board members. They also decided that, like most of them, the World Bank would be the interim trustee, though now it is the permanent one. But it has a very hands-off role in that it keeps the money. But there is also an independent GCF secretariat. So there's a secretariat that manages the day-to-day of GCF operations, which I'll talk about in a bit, that sits in Songdo, Korea. So obviously that was in 2010, and then the GCF governing instrument was adopted in 2017, or not 2017, COP17 in 2011 in Durban. And one of the other things I will say that in the decision to establish the GCF, it also included important mandates related to the need to have environmental and social safeguards, related to accountability, related to stakeholder participation, et cetera. And so all of those things are in the governing instrument, including explicitly a gender mandate. And then the last thing to just sort of point out about the establishment is that the GCF also reports to and receives guidance from the COP every year. So as one of the operating entities of the financial mechanism, the GCF has to report back to the conference of the parties every year and to get guidance from all of the parties. So while it's operated by an independent secretariat and by a board, it does have a relationship and a tie to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. Next slide. So a bit on how it works. Sorry, I have to take a sip of water. So the general operations of the GCF is that it has, as I've mentioned, a 24-member board. The board meets basically 3 times a year. There are some years when it meets more frequently than that, but not often. And when it meets, it approves funding proposals and accreditation of entities that can bring the funding proposals. It also approves budgets. It approves policies like the environmental and social policy, like the gender policy and action plan, like a number of fiduciary policies. And it basically operates as a full board. It also has committees that will meet periodically throughout the year to discuss different aspects. And then the day-to-day business of the GCF, and I think what's important to know, is that it has an independent secretariat that has approximately 300 people who are the people who make it run. And so they have a staff that's largely based in Songdo, where it's headquartered, that then work with the different entities around the world, different countries, do stakeholder engagement, work to develop the policies that then the board will approve, and also works with entities to develop the funding proposals that are going to come forward to receive funding. Importantly, there are independent units that sit at the GCF. There's an independent redress mechanism, which is a grievance mechanism that communities or any individual who thinks they will be harmed or are harmed by a GCF funded project can go to seek redress and remedy, which is a critical component of accountability and making sure that GCF, the climate finance projects aren't having other negative impacts on the environment, on human rights, on the rights of indigenous peoples, on women, etc. There's an independent evaluation unit that assesses how the GCF is doing and writes a number of reports each year. And there's an independent integrity unit that deals with issues around fraud and corruption, amongst other things. And then important really critical partners of the GCF are at the sort of national and international level, and not part of the sort of secretariat, are the nationally designated authorities in each of the countries that receives GCF funding, and then the accredited entities. And they're international access entities, which includes all of the big multilateral development banks, can include other international banks, and organizations, and then direct access entities, which are entities in countries that can get direct access. And so the GCF accredits entities, accredits groups or organizations, or mainly banks, some sort of government agencies, et cetera, who are then eligible to receive funding, who develop funding proposals and then get the funding from the GCF. All of the accredited entities have to be, or given a stamp of approval from the countries, particularly direct access entities. And it's really the main way that the GCF works. Next slide. So how the GCF works a bit, and I'll try to go through this quickly. So as I've mentioned, there's accreditation. So entities apply for accreditation and have to show that they have the necessary policies to have the climate finance. So those are fiduciary policies, environmental and social policies. They have to have a grievance mechanism, et cetera. And so they go through this process in order to try and access financing. And then really critically for the GCF, they have a large readiness program where the GCF will work with entities to try and get them ready to be able to have finance. And so it provides some money to sort of help entities get to this finance. And then there's project or program preparation. And so in order to get money, you have to develop a project or program. And this is somewhat tied to readiness. And so readiness, it works through NDAs can get it, accredited entities can get it, and then accredited entities can also get project preparation money to develop projects and programs that can then go to the board for approval. And so then it gets to the stage of funding proposals, which come to the board. There's sort of the initial way of doing it, the project approval process, and then on recognition that this was taking a long time, because oftentimes projects would be in the pipeline for years, they created a simplified approval process for smaller projects, for projects that have that have minimal environmental and social risks, and that would therefore not sort of take as much, in theory, as much time to develop and get approved, because there could be slightly different ways of looking at it with the smaller amount of money and the less risk associated. Importantly, the GCF has always had a mandate or a mandate to have a balance of funding for mitigation and adaptation. And so the goal is to have a 50-50 balance. This is, depending on who you ask, has or has not been achieved, and depending on how you look at things, because they also have cross-cutting programs. If I didn't mention this already, the GCF can also provide money in different forms. And so it provides grants, it provides loans, it provides equity, and it provides guarantees. And so then that also factors into how you equate whether they're at a 50-50 balance for mitigation and adaptation. And then once money goes out the door, then there's obviously project and program implementation on the ground. And critically, as part of that, there's also then monitoring. There's supposed to be participatory monitoring by communities and people on the ground in the project area, as well as monitoring by the GCF itself through the receiving of annual performance reports on the projects, et cetera. And so this is the sort of whole cycle of how it works. And just to note, the GCF has some key policies on fiduciary standards, on environmental and social standards. So it has an environmental and social policy. It's the process, a very lengthy process of developing its own environmental and social safeguards. It has a standalone Indigenous peoples policy, has a gender policy and a gender action plan. It also has policies on whistleblower and witness protection, and amongst other things. And so just to flag, and so those are important policies for how they work with entities, and what the standards that accredited entities have to meet in their funding proposals, and in their project and program implementation. And then obviously also important, especially for all of us and the Observer Network and GCF Watch, is also policies around stakeholder engagement, because it's critical to have that. And all of this is also, the GCF's model is very much supposed to be a country-driven model. And so all of this, the accredited entities, the NDAs, et cetera, are designed so that it's really countries who are supposed to be owning and wanting and having projects that they deem necessary. It doesn't always work exactly this way, especially with big multi-country programs. But that's the design, is that country ownership is really supposed to be at the core of the GCF. Next slide. And then just a bit so people know, the GCF is capitalized and replenished by through a replenishment cycle. It happens every 4 years. The primary contributors are developed countries, given that they are the ones who owe the climate finance, and have that sort of climate debt. Developing countries can contribute, and some do. The last replenishment was last year in 2023, at which the GCF received $12.8 billion. And then you can also see here a dashboard of the GCF's portfolio, in that they've committed through grants, loans, equity guarantees, $15 billion. They're implementing $12.3 billion worth of GCF money that they've spent in projects and programs. So those are ones that have actually started being implemented. They've dispersed $4.6 billion. So that's the amount that they've actually delivered to the accredited entities. And then the GCF also looks at and quite values co-financing. And so you can see that the total sort of co-financing value of what they calculate of these projects is $58.7 billion. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the relationship between the GCF and the other funds. Next. So in recent years, there's been an increasing push towards complementarity and coherence among the various multilateral climate funds. And they are trying to work together to increase this. So as we've mentioned, as we'll have other people later talking about the GEF, the Adaptation Fund, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and the GCF. And so the reason they really want to improve complementarity and coherence is to make it easier for countries and accredited entities, because there are a lot of different policies and a lot of different rules. And so this, making those making them more complementary and making them cohere more with each other and be similar to each other will help accredited entities, will help countries be able to meet those and hopefully then access finance quicker. Because one of the big challenges with the GCF and with climate finance overall is access. And then it can also allow for joint projects or for scaling up, so that if there's a small project that comes through the GEF or the Adaptation Fund, if there are similar policies in place, then that can ideally be scaled up by the GCF without much extra extra sort of legwork to be like, oh, well, do you have, a stakeholder engagement plan or the various things you have to have? So in thinking through like the best way for this to work would be, as I've mentioned, having similar policies, but what's critical is that there's then an upward harmonization in those policies as opposed to a race to the bottom. Because we don't want the increase on complementarity and coherence to mean that the financial mechanisms with higher standards lower them to make them the same as to meet other ones, but rather that the ones with lower standards raise them. It can also lead to fast track accreditation of entities because most of these, the Adaptation Fund, for example, accredits entities as well. And so if you're accredited to the Adaptation Fund and the Adaptation Fund and the GCF have similar policies, it could make accreditation faster at the GCF, which is important because right now accreditation takes on average 2 or 3 years. And you can fast track funding proposals because if you have a proof of concept or a thing that we're going forward, then you can get funding proposals. I will mention that right now the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage is also the GCF Secretariat is supporting it as it gets set up. And there have been some efforts as evidence to align observer work. And there are, as you'll see later, observers at the different entities, and we can communicate, and we do communicate often with one another to sort of share, but it's also important that the different entities have different observer approaches, and maintaining observer independence in their coordination is critical. Next slide, and I swear I'm almost done. The last thing I'll mention is that with the GCF, and thanks to Heinrich Bull and Liana, who you'll hear from later for this graphic, to try and demonstrate a bit, but not quite. The GCF really is the sort of largest and the most central fund. And the Adaptation Fund and the GEF are smaller, they fund smaller projects. And the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage doesn't yet fund as it's still being set up. But this really means that the GCF has the power as the sort of biggest fund to sort of scale up projects that have already demonstrated proof of concept. And this is really important, I think, to think through because then we can take good adaptation projects, good mitigation projects from the GEF and really amplify them, either those projects themselves or replicate them if they're replicable, depending on country and country circumstances and what countries want. And that is one really, I think, key way that the entities can and should work together to really amplify and build on the amount of climate finance, especially in a world in which we have limited climate finance. And that is the end. So thank you so much, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Erica, for this very comprehensive presentation. And I think it definitely sets a great foundation for the conversation we'll have in the panel shortly with the representatives from the 4 different funds. And just wanted to remind everyone that if you have comments or questions to Erica or to any other panelists today, you can leave them on the Q&A box. We'll have a time after the panel to discuss them and to address the questions. So moving to our second presentation, please welcome Ira Guerrero. Ira is the External Communications Manager at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, and she'll be presenting the GCF Watch platform for us today. So thank you, Ira. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Camila, and thank you for inviting me today. So hello, everyone. Good evening from Southeast Asia. I'm Ira Dominic Guerrero, the Communications Manager of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. We are based in the Philippines. And I'll be talking to you today about the GCF Watch platform. So first, to set the context, as Erica mentioned earlier, the GCF is the largest multilateral climate fund, and it is central to the global climate finance architecture. So the active involvement of diverse stakeholders is really crucial to ensure that the GCF is transparent and equitable. So the Observer Network of Civil Society, Indigenous Peoples, and Local Communities, which ICSC is a part of, as well as AIDA, CL, and a lot of organizations in this webinar tonight. We represent a huge knowledge base that is responsible for groundbreaking work and grassroots mobilization in relation to the Green Climate Fund. So what is GCF Watch? So GCF Watch is the kind of the platform for sharing information and collaboration on analysis, positions, and advocacy of the Observer Network. So GCF Watch, by definition, is a Southern CSO-led initiative that is aimed at promoting and accelerating global climate finance, as well as facilitating coordination and collaboration among the CSO observers of the Green Climate Fund. So we seek to become a platform of elevating local concerns to the levels of formulation, consultation, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So the GCF Watch platform is open for all. Formally, it is led by a steering committee and an advisory council, which is yet to reconvene to be able to, revisit the next steps and priorities of the platform. So the steering committee is composed of representatives of the regional nodes, which is Asia and the Pacific, Latin America, and Africa. And then enabling members that's composed of the active observers of the Observer Network and conveners. So this is the highest governing body of GCF Watch, and it is responsible for ensuring the achievement of the objectives and sustainability of the initiative. And then the advisory council is invited to join GCF Watch to support the steering committee. So GCF Watch is made by CSOs and for CSOs. It aims to share information on the GCF processes in different countries more effectively. It contributes to enabling local civil society, local community representatives, and indigenous groups to keep pace with national discussions. It aims to track more regularly and efficiently the in-country progress regarding the GCF, and this is what we um, are able to achieve for now. It serves as an information hub on the GCF that is independent from the GCF Secretariat. So for now, the GCF Watch website houses all the comments provided by the Observer Network to the annual to the regular board meetings of the Green Climate Fund. So there's still a lot of room for improvement as the creation of content still remains a challenge. That's why we hope to be able to get more people to join in. So how does the GCF Watch work? So first is content sharing. Organizations can share their content materials as long as it follows basic guidelines and is in line with the mandate of GCF Watch. Next is content curation. The steering committee and advisory council will manage how the content are presented. And lastly, it is call to action to the target stakeholders of the Observer Network. Yeah, so I just have some I'll just be showing here the current platforms of the GCF Watch. So first, as I have mentioned earlier, we have a GCF Watch website. I'll be showing the links at the end of this presentation. So this is where we house all the materials related to the GCF Watch and the Observer Network of civil society, indigenous people, and local communities. And we have regular updates on the board meetings of the Green Climate Fund. So this is where we post all the CSO comments on different financial proposals, policies and information materials of the GCF. And this is where we also post the regular updates and documentation of what is happening during the GCF board meetings. We also post regularly on our social media platforms regarding the Observer Network's engagements and activities during board meetings. As you can see here, we have posted some pictures of the preparatory meetings for the GCF board meetings, as well as meetings with the executive director and different units of the GCF as well. So we are currently doing some improvements on the project tracker. So when you open the GCF Watch page, you can see the project tracker tab on the top of the page, and then there you can see a compilation of financial proposals submitted to the GCF, and there you can also access the link to the comments of the Observer Network. So right now we're trying to improve as well the look and the user experience of this project tracker, and we are also working on integrating here the CSO comments on GCF policies as well. And then, yeah, just want to highlight the recent statements as well of the Observer Network on the complementarity and coherence of the GCF on the different funds, as discussed as well by Erica earlier. And this is specifically related to the fund for responding to loss and damage, since it was followed by the last board meeting in Songdo. So this is just some of the materials that we are releasing on GCF Watch, where we highlight the statements made by the Observer Network during board meetings. And then, yeah, this is also one of the statements that we've released in the last board meeting, the 39th board meeting of the GCF, where the Observer Network expressed its concern on the partnerships and access strategy of the GCF. This is where the Observer Network voiced out that the GCF needs to prioritize providing direct access to local communities, civil societies, and indigenous peoples, and that needs to be reflected on the policies of the fund. So yeah, this is my last slide. So I just want to reiterate that the contributions of civil society, indigenous peoples, and local communities to the GCF should be prioritized. So this is not only a right, but is also a significant value add to the discussion. So yeah, as I've mentioned earlier, here are the links to the GCF Watch platforms. Thank you for listening. And I hope you all have a good evening. And I look forward as well to a very productive panel discussion after this.
Thank you very much, Ira, for presenting the GCF Watch platform, all its resources. And sorry, as Ira mentioned, you can follow the GCF Watch on social media, visit its website regularly to find information about the Green Climate Fund and the monitoring efforts of the civil society that has been engaging with the fund. So after these two amazing opening presentations, we'll now move to our panel with civil society representatives that have been engaging with these 4 different funds. So to compose this panel, we have Faisal Parish. Faisal is the director of the Global Environment Center and is currently the chair of the JEP CSO network. We also have Julia Grimm. Julia is a senior advisor for climate finance and adaptation at German Watch, and she coordinates the Adaptation Fund and NGO network. We also have Kairos de la Cruz. Kairos is the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, and he's currently serving as an active observer of the civil society organizations at the Green Climate Fund. And we have Lian Shalatek. Lian is the Associate Director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C. She's also part of the GCF Active Observers team and is highly engaged with the new fund for responding to loss and damage. So thank you all so much for participating on this panel today. And we'd like to start the conversation giving a general overview of these 4 different funds. Maybe we can start with the Global Environment Facility, the GCF. So Faisal, if you could please tell us a little bit in a few words about the GCF, how it is structured, what does it finance, and so on, a brief overview for people today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Camilla. So I personally have been following GCF for nearly 30 years, so followed it through the times and the changes. GCF is the oldest global environment finance mechanism, established in 1992, just prior to the Earth Summit in Rio. Over the years, it's had a total disbursement of about $18 billion and leveraged about $94 billion in co-financing. It's financed more than 4,500 projects in 170 countries. The Secretariat is based in Washington, D.C., about 150 staff, but most of the implementation of the GCF finance is through GCF agencies. There are currently about 23 of these agencies, mainly the International Finance Institutes, UN agencies, some international civil society organizations, WWF, Conservation International, IUCN are GCF agencies. That was something we strongly lobbied for, plus a limited number of national agencies. That was more as a pilot. It's not really expanded beyond there. In terms of access to the fund or distribution of the funds, the GCF money is generated on a 4-year replenishment basis, like the GCF. We're now in the 8th replenishment, which is currently $5.3 billion. Majority of that amount is allocated to countries according to quite complex formula based on the size of the country, its significance of greenhouse gas emissions, significance for biodiversity. And GCF, in contrast to GCF, has a multifocal outlook. So it's the financing mechanism for climate change, but also Biodiversity Convention, CBD, land degradation, so CCD. It also supports work on chemicals and waste, Minamata Convention, and others, and also international waters. So that fund, although it sounds very large, is then divided across the different programs, so a bit less. But GCF does encourage multifocal projects, so that combine biodiversity, land degradation, with biodiversity. And so that brings together and gets some synergy of the funds. In terms of the access, as I said, most is allocated to countries through a so-called country allocation. And then the entry point for the project development is that the project proponents, which currently are primarily government agencies facilitated by the various partners, are requesting for the grants. So just a concept or project identification form needs to be done and submitted. That's approved by the GCF Council, meets twice a year. And then after the PIF approval, it takes 12 to 18 months for the full project development. In the past, there were very major delays in the project development cycle. GCF has made quite a good attempt to speed that up, but still there are some challenges. But overall, there have been significant improvements in GCF, but it remains a very significant fund. And as was mentioned in the earlier presentation, there are opportunities to scale up some of the smaller GCF programs and proven work to scale it up through GCF projects. So I'll stop with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Faisal, for this GCF overview. Now let's move to the Adaptation Fund. So Julia, welcome. And could you please provide us a general overview of this fund?
Yes, thank you. So the Adaptation Fund is actually functioning very similar to the Green Climate Fund. So many of the things that Erica presented in her presentation on the GCF also apply to the Adaptation Fund. So I will try to maybe only focus on the differences here. So we said the Adaptation Fund is a much smaller fund. It only focuses on adaptation projects and not on mitigation, as well as the GCF does. It provides only grant finance, and compared to the GCF, who also provides loans, equities, and guarantees. So it's only grant finance, and it finances the full cost of projects. So it doesn't require co-finance. Projects are up to 10 million US dollars, so it's also rather small projects. It also works through accredited entities who implement projects. Those can be either national ones, regional ones, or multilateral ones. And what is special here is that it is the only fund that has reserved a certain amount of funding for direct access entities, which it considers national implementing entities and regional ones. So half of its resources are supposed to be reserved for those direct access entities to implement projects, which I think is quite notable. And the fund also only allows up to 2 national accredited entities so far, which is also mainly due to the limited funding, limited capacities of the Adaptation Fund Secretariat, because it's much smaller than the GCF one. And yes, so it has also a country cap. So countries can only access up to 20 million US dollars currently under the fund, which is also due to the limited resources the funds get, because the fund doesn't have a replenishment mechanism like the GCF has. It depends every year to mobilize resources at COPs, usually from contributing countries. Originally, it was financed by a share of the proceeds under the Clean Development Mechanism. And now it's also supposed to be funded by a 5% share of proceeds under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. However, it's not clear when this money will come, how stable those resources are, and it heavily depends still on contributions from countries. And so I think it is still the fund is still quite limited in what it could actually do because of the limited resources it receives. It has had a funding window for enhanced direct access, which is now a locally led adaptation funding window, which is quite remarkable maybe to mention. But I think for now it will finish this overview, and maybe if there are a few more questions I can reply to.
Yes, perfect. No, thank you, Julia. It's interesting to see the similarities and especially the differences among these funds, and we'll of course discuss more of that later on. Now, Kairos, tell us a bit about the Green Climate Fund. Erica already shared some very relevant information in her presentation, gave us an overview of the GCF. But what else could you highlight for people who want to know more about the GCF?
That's a very good question. Very good prompt, especially that Erica already mentioned, I think, most of what we're going to present. Anyway, but I think I can just focus on the transformative approach of the GCF, which I think is quite consistent given the sort of encompassing reason why it was formed in the first place, and the ambition that the fund should have. When you go to the GCF website, it basically listed 4 different approaches. First is transformational planning and programming, which means largely the fund promotes to integrate strategies, planning, and policymaking to maximize the co-benefits of all the interventions that are being implemented by the fund through the fund support. Next is catalyzing climate innovation, which allows the GCF to sort of invest in new technologies. And the third one is de-risking investment to mobilize finance at scale. As mentioned by the previous speakers, the GCF sort of has this flexibility of using various modalities of disbursing funds. It's not sort of, it doesn't even have to choose specifically which one to use for a particular funding proposal. It can be a combination of many things like loans, concessional financing, grants, and so on. So the idea behind that is that the GCF should be able to mobilize more finance, more needed climate finance at scale. And the last is mainstreaming climate risk and opportunities into investment decision making, mostly in national circumstances or in the national implementing arena. I raised this four sort of transformative approach by the GCF because I think, as we go along in this webinar, it would also be important to sort of look back into these four in terms of the fund's performance, whether it's doing well, what is not doing so well, among other things. Yeah, so if there's anything I can add, it's going to be these four approaches implemented by the GCF.
Great, thank you, Kairos. And now moving to the recently established fund for responding to loss and damage. Lian, we know that the fund is just beginning to take these first steps toward becoming operational. So what can you share with us about this process so far?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak on the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, the new finance kit on the block, an operating entity, really, really important. I think it's important to understand that the obviously funding to address the loss and damage is kind of a new funding mandate, something that countries and civil society have fought for a very long time, to have a fund that explicitly addresses that. There are implicit, for example, disaster risk management elements that other funds are also taking into account, like the GCF, the GEF, and the Adaptation Fund. But this is really meant as a fund to focus on addressing loss and damage. It was established with a decision at COP28. We have set up a board, which is, as mentioned, has equitable representation. So it's a 26-member board with 14 members from developing countries, 2 LDCs and SIDS. And that's obviously quite important because it speaks to who is affected. We had a design process similar to what we had with the Green Climate Fund in 2023 in the transitional committee, a transitional committee that resulted in a governing instrument. So we get a glimpse of what the fund is supposed to do. The board has met 3 times this year already, and what they have focused on is very much on the institutional setup. So we know now that the World Bank will host it as a FIF, a financial intermediary fund, with the Secretariat, basically similar to what is happening with the Adaptation Fund and the GEF. So it's a World Bank hosted Secretariat, but it is supposed to be independent and obviously respond to the board. And the board and the fund itself responds to the COP and CMA, receives guidance to them. What we do know, and that is very important, there is an interest and a willingness, how that actually is then going to be expressed in operational policies still to be developed, is to apply lessons learned from other funds, to not replicate some of the things that, for example, a lot of developing countries, but also civil society feel that might not be working so well. One of the issues, for example, that comes now is the question of who would implement and how should be implemented. So, for example, one of the access modalities that is going to be discussed is direct budget support for countries as a direct access for developing countries, but something that is also enshrined in the governing instrument. And it's very new in the sense that it's very explicitly there, is that there is a commitment that we have small grant financing support for local communities. How this is going to be institutionalized, whether it's through international access that is possible, through direct access entities. And there is a lot of talk about, for example, grandfathering in all of the accredited entities that are already in good standing with the existing funds, with the GCF, the GCF, and the Adaptation Fund, is yet a question. But I would point out in particularly that the question of the access modalities, and particularly the small grant community provision, where civil society are pushing for a dedicated community access window or facility or program with a dedicated set aside in the allocation framework of the fund for responding to loss and damage, which yet still has to be developed, is something that could really, really move us forward. One last word is the scale. We have heard that from the other funds, finance availability is a big issue. We do not know yet what the scale of the fund for responding to loss and damage is. We do know that it's supposed to have a replenishment process similar to the GCF and the GCF every 4 years. But right now, we actually only have commitments of 680 million, which is obviously not enough to do a comprehensive funding for a response to extreme weather events, as well as long-term loss and damage like sea level rise. And so it's really a question to still articulate the vision, how comprehensive the fund should support activities, or whether it's a narrower targeted band, and also what the overall scale of the fund is going to be. And a lot of those questions are going to be tackled at the 4th board meeting this year, which is going to be in Manila, the Philippines, post-COP29. Thanks.
Thank you, Lian. It was a great summary of the process with the new fund so far. Before we continue with the panel, I just want to remind everyone that if you have comments or questions to our panelists or to Erica and Ira, who presented before, you can leave them on the Q&A box, please. We'll have some time after the panel for them to address the questions and to comment them. Now we wanted to talk a little bit about participation of civil society in these funds, and how do you see the spaces for advocacy and engagement of civil society in the 4 different funds. So Kairos, could you share a little bit about how it works with the Green Climate Fund? How do you see the participation of civil society? What could be improved? If you can share us a little bit on the GCF.
Okay. For the GCF, I think it's a lot of when you talk about civil society organizations, when you talk about observers, when you talk about representatives of indigenous peoples and local communities, I think a huge part of it, the task is basically pushing for more space, pushing and asking for more space in very critical policies, in boardroom discussions, in discussions even outside the boardroom, to make sure that the concerns of those who are not given the privilege to be present inside the boardroom are heard and reflected at the very least. It's a lot of push and pull. And of course, after you establish the space, I think observers are quite well in filling the space as well. Ensuring that there's meaningful participation within the space that has been won or provided. And it's not as if the GCF is sort of cultivating this culture. It's a culture by observers across all funds that have sort of mutated across the years. I mean, if I heard it right, Mr. Faisal has been around in the GCF for 30 years. For sure, I haven't been around in the GCF for 30 years. But the thing is, I mean, the learnings from the GCF, the learnings from the Adaptation Fund is sort of getting transformed along the way and being used by the GCF observers as well. Another role is, utilizing the strengths of civil society organizations and indigenous peoples and local communities, which is really pushing hard for advocacy within and outside the boardroom. I think it's very critical. Discussions are being policies and decisions are being arrived at during board meetings. But I think a lot of the work happened, if not majority of the work happened outside the boardroom in between the months wherein the secretariat is still preparing for the board meeting in the first place. And the last part that I would share is that I think observers are becoming more known to be experts as well in terms of institutional memory, in terms of reflecting the value of the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. I think there's a growing recognition, maybe not just on the GCF Secretariat, but at least among some of the board members, that observers are not just there to criticize. Observers are actually there to help improve proposals, help improve policies by leveraging institutional memory and the expertise that they have. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Kairos. It's interesting this that you're mentioning, right? That civil society is starting to be recognized as valuable input, right, for the proposals and the decisions being made in the fund. That is great to hear. What about the adaptation fund, Julia? How do you see the spaces for civil society participation there?
Yeah, so actually the adaptation fund is currently in a process also of changing and advancing its observer engagement, and the adaptation fund board is meeting this week in Bonn, and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow they will also decide on how to enhance observer engagement, which I think is a good development, because so far the adaptation fund, unless like the GCF, didn't have active civil society observers. So there were no civil society observers at the table when the board was meeting, and there were no space for them to discuss certain agenda items and to provide their input. There were other ways of providing input for civil society. For example, ahead of the board meetings, the adaptation fund always uploaded all the project proposals they received on their website and requested feedback from stakeholders. So any kind of stakeholder could provide feedback on those project proposals, which they would then consider when reviewing project proposals. So they were getting this feedback already in advance of the board meeting, because if I understand also correctly, within the GCF, it's only at the board meetings where civil society can make points on those proposals. So I think this is quite a good practice, what other funds can use also to learn from. And then another thing that stood out was the civil society dialogue that the Adaptation Fund board held at every board meeting with civil society. So this was a particular agenda point at every board meeting where civil society could organize inputs on policies they were discussing, but also feedback from country experiences with the Adaptation Fund on certain projects, and present that to the board and discuss with the board afterwards. So this was a very, I think unique and important opportunity to engage with the Adaptation Fund board. So I think that's definitely, I think, a best practice that other funds could also try to implement. And now the board actually decided to introduce active civil society observers. And what they decide now in Bonn is how this will look like. So we already collected a lot of input on the GCF active civil observer experience, and will make or want to make sure that those experiences and lessons learned are reflected. And very much hope that we will soon have active observers in the Adaptation Fund as well. And I think because those funds are so similar in how they work, so it's so important that also civil society cooperates well. So between particularly the GCF and the Adaptation Fund, and we can learn from particularly also the GCF experience. And so I think maybe I leave it to that for the moment.
Okay, no, thank you, Julia, for sharing. It's interesting to see these exchanges between CSOs engaging with the different funds and what they can learn from each other's experiences, right? To trying to replicate best practices from one fund into the others. Now moving to the Jeff, Faisal, you're currently the chair of the CSO network on the Jeff. So could you share us a little bit about how is the civil society engagement? How do you see room for improvement on the Global Environment Facility?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Camilla. So CSOs have been engaged really since the beginning of GEF. We actually engaged in lobbying for the creation of GEF. And then formally in 1995, at the end of the pilot phase, the GEF Council, I think it's almost its first meeting, came with a decision about the engagement of civil society observers in the GEF. And that led to the formation of the GEF CSO network, originally called GEF NGO network in 1995. So initially, the GEF Secretariat undertook the accreditation of civil society organizations to the GEF. But in 2011, we were able to persuade the GEF and the council that the GEF should be replaced by membership in the GEF CSO network. So to give the power to the CSOs to admit and monitor and control the engagement in the GEF, and that's continued to this day. We have currently about 600 plus members, 110 countries. The members elect 16 regional focal points from different sub-regions, and that they help facilitate the work through a global coordination committee. All of the activities are voluntary. From time to time, previously in the past, we used to get small contribution from GEF Secretariat, about 50,000 a year, but for the last 10 years or so, the network entirely self-funding. But that is a bit of a challenge to maintain and manage databases and organize meetings. We, basically from the beginning, have basically taken the lead on organizing a CSO GEF Council consultation the day before the council meetings. That used to be a one-day session. Up till 2017, the network took the key role in that. From 2017 onwards, the GEF Secretariat basically took a much stronger role in stakeholder engagement, and basically, to be frank, diluted the work of civil society network, and the GEF Secretariat staff were the one that kept selecting those to come and organizing the session. And frankly, they became less useful for strategic policy interaction, and they became more a sort of showcase of what GEF is doing and positive points. But in the last year, we've been trying to change that again and to get the consultation sessions, which now currently are basically done online. So there's more engagement, but it's less face-to-face dialogue with the council members. So there's some changes over time, but I think the network has been able to significantly engage. In terms of policy making, we have very good access now to the council. And as of, I think, decision in about 2015, we are now able to speak on every agenda item in the council, and we can even speak prior to the council members speaking. So we can give statements based on the papers on each agenda item. I think a very significant thing, although sometimes there's tension with the Secretariat, sometimes I think the Secretariat feel that when we criticize some things, we're criticizing the Secretariat. But I would say that sometimes lead to a love-hate relationship, but we're working on that and generally it becoming positive, and now it's coming back. But from the council members, we rarely get positive feedback from council members. And in the recent councils, we're documenting maybe 30 to 50% of the statements that we make to council are then echoed or highlighted by multiple council members. And I think the last council meeting in June, I think something like almost 50% of the council members during the course of the council highlighted some intervention from the CSO network and urged the GEF or encouraged the GEF to follow that guidance, particularly on broader engagement of civil society. And I think that is really helping move forward to advance things. One other negative aspect that happened over time in the beginning there was much better direct access to funds, to civil society. In the beginning, so it's about 25 years ago, about 5 to 6% of all GEF resources was channeled through direct CSO-led projects. So directly coming to the CSOs for implementation. Unfortunately, that has declined to about 1%. One major reason for that is now the government at the country level is given the funds to decide who gets it, and generally they decide that they'll keep it amongst government agencies. Some of the GEF agencies try to encourage CSO engagement, but basically government decides in the end. But we've been lobbying and lobbying to increase that, and we currently have the support of the current CEO of the GEF, who used to be the Vice President of Conservation International, as well as being the Environment Minister of Costa Rica. And he has a strong support for civil society. And he basically has supported a target for direct access to resources by civil society, indigenous people, local community of 10% of GEF resources by 2030. So basically in the next replenishment cycle to shift to that. And I think that's a very positive move, but he needs the support of all civil society to push, pressure, lobby during the upcoming GEF 9 replenishment period, which is basically starting from next year, to push to get that into concrete agreed mechanism for that. So I think there are a lot of parallel and lesson learned and sharing, and also things that we can learn from the other programs. We don't have something like the GCF Watch where we're putting all the projects online. We are getting access to those projects maybe a few weeks before the council, but we don't have yet a best way to reach out to everyone and get the inputs. So maybe we need to share some lessons or learn from the GCF Watch, and also maybe how to look about cross-linking where we've got similar projects types being developed under GEF that have been looked at under GCF, and already civil society engaged on that, mobilized, that we can draw somehow on that expertise of the other networks to at least maybe have some common platform on key emerging project types or problems or challenges, and how particularly to enhance the level of engagement of civil society in either direct implementation or being key implementation partners together with the government in the project implementation. So I'll leave it as that. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal, for this overview on the participation on the GEF. Now, moving to the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. Lian, the fund is still working on the modalities for the participation of civil society observers, right? So what does civil society engage with the new fund once you see in this regard, and what do you think we can expect from the new fund?
Yeah, thanks so much again for the opportunity, and it's also great to hear how civil society engagement is happening, or it's sometimes not happening enough in other funds, because again, the goal of the civil society colleagues cross-constituency that are engaging right now in the Loss and Damage Fund is actually really to apply lessons learned and push for as much improvement as we want to get. And I want to point out, as Faisal said, and as also was the case in the Green Climate Fund and the Transitional Committee, actually civil society is acting as an expert, has provided inputs, including, for example, putting forward a draft governing instrument as part of the Transitional Committee process for the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. So that expertise that Kairos mentions of civil society, how processes can work from applying the lived experiences of the communities that we work with, the feedback is really there. So at the moment, and I think Julia will be happy to hear that, we actually have been able in the 3 board meetings that we had for the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage to institute or have a similar civil society dialogue with board members. It's part of the official agenda, or has been for the last 3 board members. It's a 1.5 hour slot where we actually not only basically present ideas for the policies that are under discussion for the fund, but also have the back and forth with board members. And we obviously want to keep that as an issue forward. The Fund for Responding for Loss and Damage will have active observers, but how many those are and which constituencies they represent is not yet clear. The governing instrument only points out that there are at minimum basically 4 active observers representing indigenous peoples, youth and children, women and gender, and environmental NGOs, but there are obviously other groups that are pushing for it. And because the observer participation policies have not yet been set, the fund at the moment is operating under interim observer participation, which basically allows as quote unquote interim active observer a representative from each of the 9 UNFCCC constituencies in the room. So including farmers, the trade unions, theoretically also the bingo, the business community, which has not been so far represented. Very important is, again, the 4th board meeting, because the complex of observer participation policies is to be decided at the next board meeting, the one in early December. That includes the active observer policy. This includes also what is currently called the accreditation procedure of observer organizations. And there, and Faisal, I hear you, we want to obviously push back on something that makes it very onerous for institutions to be accredited or have what we, for example, have in the Green Climate Fund, where the board actually in a decision approves which observer organizations it admits as a registered observer organization. There's are also supposed to be consultative forums. We are not quite sure yet whether that's supposed on the fund level, whether that's supposed to be on the in-country basis, what they entail. All of that is supposed to be discussed, but that also means because nobody really has an idea yet how it should work, there is a lot of room to bring ideas forward and actually push for some of the best practice or better practice approaches. I want to point out 2 other things that are really, really important. One is the additional rules of procedure for the Loss and Damage Fund board still are not completely set. Those are hugely important for the participation of observers because they speak to the question of whether meetings are webcast, documentation available in which language, how and when documents are released. So we are putting a lot of pressure from civil society side on having the best additional rules of procedure possible. That's the one thing. Second one is the travel policy. We also know that the participation for civil society and observer engagement, particularly from developing countries, and particularly if we want to have local and affected communities, needs to be funded. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible. This is still not done in the Green Climate Fund. The Adaptation Fund is doing it to some extent and is considering it. We absolutely need that in the Loss and Damage Fund. And then the last thing I want to mention, and this is again also a lesson learned from the Green Climate Fund, is that we really need to improve the participation and engagement of the active observers in board proceedings between meetings. For example, in decision between meetings, where right now there is not a formal engagement process. This is something that we need to tackle from the start in the Loss and Damage Fund to the extent that we can get it and really push for, again, lessons learned, upscaling. I think the goal of the comparison, as Erica has said earlier, is not going to the lowest common denominator, but actually upscaling all of our experiences and then using better practices in one of the other fund as a reason to push for the improvement in the respective fund that might be lagging behind. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. And I agree on what you're saying, that this new fund has this great opportunity to learn from previous CSO's experiences with the other funds, both on what has been working, but also on what can be improved, right? So we'll be attentive to the upcoming decision there. So we have a few minutes left on the webinar and many questions from the audience to address. So I would like to make a quick round and ask you to please answer very briefly so we can address as many questions as we can. We can start with the GCF. So Erica and Kairos, who presented on that, if you want to address them. The first one It's regarding the criteria used to review and approve funding proposals and accreditation. So if you could briefly comment anything on that. And the second question we have on the GCF, it says, I would like to ask in what ways the GCF is advancing the issue of inclusive decision-making, especially when it comes to supporting indigenous peoples and local communities and women. How are civil society observers chosen? So there are actually 3 questions on the GCF, if you can comment just briefly on them.
Maybe I can come in quickly just on how funding proposals are assessed. So both the Secretariat and an independent technical advisory panel do an assessment of funding proposals. There are 6 investment criteria that they look at when they're doing it. So impact potential, paradigm shift potential, sustainable development potential, needs of the recipients, country ownership, and efficiency and effectiveness of the funds. And so that's what the ITAP will look at, and the Secretariat does as well. The Secretariat also assesses the project against the environmental and social standards, the gender policy, fiduciary standards, whether there's too much financial concentration in one accredited entity as part of the assessment, as well as some legal things related to their legal arrangements with accredited entities. And on accredited entities, they assess them largely against sort of the policies that the GCF has, like how they meet and are able to comply with the fiduciary policies, how they're able to comply with the environmental and social policies, whether they have a grievance mechanism, what their stakeholder engagement policies are. So that's a lot of how they assess it. And maybe I'll just say one thing on inclusive decision making, and then I'll let Kairos speak. So the GCF struggles somewhat with inclusive decision making, I would say, and we constantly push them on that. You know, there's supposed to be engagement at the country level, at the project level, at the local level, in developing the projects, and there should always be that engagement, and it shouldn't just be a checkbox exercise, but really working with the communities and indigenous peoples for how projects are developed. And then at the board itself, as I think was mentioned, there are active observers, and we as a network of civil society, indigenous peoples, local communities, try to reach out to people in countries, but also take into account everything to then give feedback to the board members and to give comments to them, both before the formal meeting and then obviously in the formal meeting. The active observers speak on behalf of the network to try and make sure our voices are part of the decision-making process and that the board is taking those into consideration. But over to you, Kairos.
Yeah, plus one on everything that Erica said. But I think if there's anything I can add, it's in terms of inclusive decision making. I think the GCF, just like most big funds and big organizations, should accept that having a policy is not the end of it all. Having really good policies on some critical pieces of work, like indigenous peoples, gender policy, it's not going to be enough if there's not enough sort of feedback loop wherein you can actually reflect country level and local experiences as well, so that you can further improve the policy and further improve the accountability of those who are using up the funds, as well as the accountability of the board in considering these really serious issues in making decisions. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Erica and Kairos. Julia, we have a very direct question regarding the adaptation fund. If an institution can be accredited in both the adaptation fund and the GCF, so if you could address that.
Yes, actually there are many, particularly also national implementing entities who started with accreditation with the adaptation fund, implemented a project, and then scaled up their projects at the GCF, became an accredited entity at GCF. So we can really see that the adaptation fund is also a good way for newer, smaller national implementing entities to start with implementing projects and then progress towards the Green Climate Fund. So yes, that's the case. And I also saw that there's one question on the Adaptation Fund regarding how one can become an observer. So currently, the Adaptation Fund allows for all accredited UNFCCC observers to register and observe Adaptation Fund board meetings. And when they will now introduce active observers, they said that this would also, those observers would need to be from accredited UNFCCC entities. And it would be 2 active observers and 2 alternates. And there should be a balance, the gender balance and the balance between developed and developing countries. And that this would be handled by a self-selection process among civil society. So what I have done in the past weeks is I've reached out to a lot of UNFCCC civil society constituencies, and we created an email list through which we plan to organize the active civil society observer engagement to make that participative and have all groups represented. So I hope that as many of you as possible can join that Google group. And but I think one point I would like to make to conclude is one thing is the observer engagement at board level, and the other thing is the observer engagement at country level with the implementing entities that implement the project, keep track of the project and their implementation, engage with the focal points of the funds in their countries. And this is an important work which often isn't done by the NGOs that are represented in the UNFCCC, or maybe engage a lot also at the policy level of the funds. And I think there's an important bridge that we as civil society need to build between those CSOs engaging at policy level and those at the local level. We try to do that with the Adaptation Fund CSO network to really engage local CSOs in those countries where the projects are implemented. But it takes a lot of resources to do so. And unfortunately, we couldn't find really further funding to do so. So the AFC's over effort kind of came to a halt there. And we hope that at least by this new initiative and group cross-constituency we are trying to organize, we get as many CSOs in as possible. And just to conclude.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for the comments and questions. I think it was a very productive session. Well, we're reaching the end of this first section of the 2024 GCF Watch International Webinar Series. A big thank you to all the panelists for participating here today. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else who attended did as well. And thank you also to our translation team and to everyone who attended the webinar today. And before we wrap up, I just like to remember you that the second session of the webinar series will take place on December 4th at the same time. So the second webinar will highlight best practices and also areas for improvement within the GCF, particularly focusing in topics like gender, indigenous peoples, the GCF redress mechanism, and also their environmental and social safeguards. So a lot of the discussion we had here today will continue on the second session. So we hope to see you again in December. Have a great day, afternoon, and evening, everyone.
Thanks.